Most of us were educated with the same narrative. The Cold War began due to ideology, communism against capitalism, liberty against oppression. The Soviets aimed to expand their system across the planet, and the United States heroically stepped forward to halt them. It is a tidy narrative, a comforting one, and it has been echoed so frequently in textbooks, documentaries, and political rhetoric that most individuals accept it without a second thought. But what if that narrative is incomplete? What if the actual origins of the Cold War were less about ideology and more about economics, power, and a financial structure intentionally crafted to guarantee one nation's supremacy over the rest of the globe? What if the seeds of the struggle were not sown at Yalta or Potsdam, but in a secluded resort hotel in New Hampshire, where a suspected Soviet mole helped construct the very system that would come to define American hegemony? What if historians have been pursuing the wrong question entirely? Not who initiated the Cold War, but who gained from it. To comprehend how we arrived here, you must go back further than most people anticipate. Not to 1945, not to the atomic clouds over Hiroshima, but to the ruins of the 1930s, when the global economic framework collapsed so violently that it pulled the entire world into conflict. Because the Cold War was not created in a vacuum. It was born out of the desperate, cold-blooded effort to ensure that type of collapse never occurred again, and to determine once and for all who would occupy the top of whatever new system rose from the debris. The Great Depression did not just ruin economies. It shattered the entire structure that maintained international commerce. The gold standard, which had served as the foundation of global finance since the late 1800s, disintegrated piece by piece as nations fought to protect themselves. Countries increased tariffs to irrational levels. They devalued their currencies to undermine their neighbors. They turned inward, constructing barriers around their economies while the rest of the world suffered. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, one of the most catastrophic pieces of legislation in American history, raised import duties on more than 20,000 foreign products. Other nations retaliated. Global trade plummeted by approximately 65% between 1929 and 1934. And in the wreckage of that downfall, amidst the desperate poverty, mass unemployment, and political volatility, fascism took hold in Europe. The lesson was brutally evident. Economic conflict leads to physical conflict. Beggar thy neighbor policies do not just impoverish your neighbors, they eventually return to destroy you as well. By the early 1940s, as the Second World War was still occurring across multiple continents, a small group of economists and strategists in Washington began working on something bold. They intended to build a new global economic order from the ground up, one designed to stop the disastrous cycle of depression, protectionism, and war from ever repeating. And the individual who would ultimately mold this new order more than anyone else was not a politician, not a general, and not even a particularly famous economist. He was an obscure Treasury Department official named Harry Dexter White. Now, White is one of the most intriguing and problematic figures in 20th century history. The fact that most people have never heard of him reveals a great deal about how the story of the Cold War has been narrated. Born in 1892 in Boston to Lithuanian immigrant parents, White was brilliant, ambitious, and quietly determined. He earned his doctorate from Harvard and eventually climbed the ranks of the Treasury Department under Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., becoming one of the most influential economic policymakers in the country without ever becoming a household name. While the focus was on generals and presidents, White was working in the background, drafting the blueprints for a new world. His counterpart on the British side was none other than John Maynard Keynes. Widely considered the most brilliant economist of the 20th century, Keynes was everything White was not: charismatic, aristocratic, famous, and supremely confident in his own intellect. But when the two men clashed over the design of the post-war economic system, it was the quiet American who triumphed. And the system White constructed would have consequences that neither man could have fully envisioned. In July of 1944, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations met at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war was still being waged. D-Day had occurred just weeks prior. Soldiers were dying on beaches and in hedgerows across France. And yet here, in this grand old hotel nestled in the White Mountains, Economists and diplomats from around the globe were making choices that would mold the global economy for decades. This was the Bretton Woods Conference. It was arguably one of the most significant events of the entire 20th century, but you will not find it in most people's understanding of how the Cold War started. The fundamental question at Bretton Woods was deceptively basic. How should the world manage its money after the war? But beneath that question lay a much deeper conflict, a struggle over who would control the levers of global finance, and therefore who would hold the real power in the post-war world. Keynes arrived at the conference with a plan that mirrored Britain's interests. He proposed a new international currency called the Bancor, managed by an independent international institution that would have the authority to penalize both debtor and creditor nations for maintaining excessive imbalances. Under Keynes's plan, no single country would dominate the system. It was designed to be truly multilateral, a system of equals. White had a very different vision. His plan placed the American dollar at the center of everything. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and every other currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar. The institutions White designed, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, would be headquartered in Washington and controlled primarily by the nations that contributed the most capital, which of course meant the United States. Under White's plan, America would not just participate in the new global order, America would run it. White dominated the conference. He outmaneuvered Keynes at nearly every turn, exploiting the harsh reality that Britain was essentially bankrupt and completely dependent on American loans to survive. As one historian later noted, the Americans used to their advantage the fact that the United Kingdom relied on new loans from the United States. The Bretton Woods Conference did not just create a new monetary system, it ensured the end of Britain's global financial dominance. The sun was setting on the British Empire, and White made sure America would inherit the throne. But here is where the story gets truly strange. Because while White was building a dollar-centric system that would support American hegemony for the next 80 years, he was simultaneously trying to do something that his own government would later consider treasonous. He was trying to bring the Soviet Union into the system. White's post-war vision was not simply about American dominance, it was about creating a permanent alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two great powers that he believed would determine the fate of the world after the war. He spent 5 months before Bretton Woods meeting with a high-level Soviet delegation in Washington, patiently explaining the benefits of joining the proposed international agencies and responding to their concerns about the capitalist nature of the enterprise. He was solicitous of the Soviets at the conference itself, more so than any other American negotiator, and sometimes to the frustration of the European delegations. 6 months after the conference concluded, White even proposed a massive low-interest American loan of $10 billion to help the Soviet Union rebuild, more than 3 times the transitional assistance he recommended for Britain. And then there were the espionage allegations. Over the course of roughly 11 years, beginning in the mid-1930s, White was accused of acting as a Soviet mole inside the United States government, passing secret documents and providing the Soviets with intelligence and strategic advice. 2 former members of the Communist Party of the United States, Elizabeth Bentley and Whittaker Chambers, named White as a Soviet agent during the post-war Red Scare. The declassified Venona intercepts, decoded Soviet diplomatic cables from the 1940s, contain roughly 15 references to White, fueling suspicions that the chief architect of the Western financial order was simultaneously working for the other side. Now, the truth about White is far more complicated than either his defenders or his accusers have been willing to admit. Some historians have argued that the Venona evidence, taken in context, suggests White was a target of Soviet intelligence gathering rather than an active agent. His meetings with Soviet contacts took place during a period when the 2 countries were wartime allies, and many of those meetings were publicly disclosed. The IMF's own historian has argued that the evidence for the espionage charges was always flimsy and that guilt by association was very much in vogue during the McCarthy era. On the other hand, there is no question that White provided the Soviets with information that went beyond what was necessary or appropriate, and that he was far more sympathetic to Soviet interests than the political climate of the late 1940s would tolerate. White died of a heart attack in August of 1948, just 3 days after testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee and denying any involvement in espionage. He was 55 years old. His dream of bringing the Soviet Union into the Western financial system died with him. Within 3 years of the Bretton Woods Conference, the entire vision of a cooperative post-war order that included the Soviets had collapsed, and the world had split into two hostile economic blocs. This is the critical point that most conventional histories of the Cold War miss entirely. The standard narrative tells you the Cold War began because of Soviet aggression, because Stalin grabbed Eastern Europe, because communist ideology demanded global revolution. There is truth in that narrative. Stalin was paranoid, brutal, and genuinely expansionist. The Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe was real, and it was terrifying to the people who lived through it. But what the standard narrative leaves out is the degree to which the economic architecture of the post-war world was itself a cause of the split. Think about it from the Soviet perspective for a moment. The Bretton Woods system was designed to be a dollar-centric order that would open global markets to American goods and investment. The IMF and the World Bank were controlled by Washington. The entire system was predicated on free trade, free capital flows, and the convertibility of currencies, all concepts that were fundamentally incompatible with a centrally planned economy. When the Soviets looked at Bretton Woods, they did not see a generous offer of partnership. They saw a trap, a system designed to extend American economic dominance into every corner of the world, including their own sphere of influence. The decision not to offer the Soviet Union the $10 billion reconstruction loan that White had proposed turned out to be one of the primary reasons the Soviet government decided against joining the IMF and the World Bank. Without that loan, without a meaningful stake in the new system, the Soviets had every incentive to build their own parallel economic order. And that is exactly what they did. Two economic blocs solidified, and they largely mirrored the continent's political split. Now, the Iron Curtain was not just a military boundary, it was an economic one. But the economic dimensions of the Cold War's origins go deeper still. Consider what happened with Lend-Lease. During the war, the United States had shipped an astonishing $50.1 billion worth of supplies to its allies, roughly $690 billion in today's money. The Soviet Union received about $11.3 billion worth of that aid, including 18,200 aircraft, roughly 435,000 trucks and jeeps, nearly 2,000 locomotives, and massive quantities of food, fuel, and raw materials. Without American Lend-Lease, the Soviet people would have suffered even more catastrophically than they already did, and the Red Army's advance westward would have been significantly slower. Then on May 12, 1945, just 4 days after Germany's surrender, President Truman signed an order suspending Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. The order was executed with what can only be described as shocking abruptness. Ships already at sea were ordered to turn around. Vessels in port were literally being unloaded. Stalin later told Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's former advisor, that the manner in which it had been done was unfortunate and even brutal. He said that if the refusal to continue Lend-Lease was designed as pressure on the Russians in order to soften them up, then it was a fundamental mistake. He warned Hopkins that reprisals in any form would bring about the exact opposite effect. Now, Truman later claimed the sudden termination was a bureaucratic blunder, the work of overzealous officials rather than deliberate policy. He reversed the order within 3 days, but the damage was done. The Soviets, whose entire wartime economy was built on centralized planning, had structured their industrial output around the expectation of continued American supplies. The abrupt cutoff was not just insulting, it was economically destabilizing, and it sent a very clear signal about what the new American administration thought of the wartime alliance. This is where the revisionist historians make their most compelling argument. Scholars like William Appleman Williams, whose groundbreaking 1959 work on American diplomacy shattered the comfortable myth of American isolationism, argued that the United States had been pursuing an expansionist foreign policy since at least the 1890s. Williams called it the open door policy, a systematic effort to open foreign markets to American goods and investment by removing tariffs and trade barriers wherever they existed. Under this interpretation, the Cold War was not a defensive response to Soviet aggression. It was the latest chapter in a much longer story of American economic expansion, one that happened to encounter Soviet opposition along the way. Williams' analysis was provocative, and it made a lot of people uncomfortable. But his core insight that American foreign policy was driven as much by economic imperatives as by ideological ones is hard to dismiss when you look at the evidence. The Bretton Woods system, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the entire architecture of the post-war order was designed to create a world that was open to American trade and investment. That this system also happened to contain Soviet influence was not incidental. It was the point. Consider the Marshall Plan, which is perhaps the most celebrated act of American foreign policy in the 20th century. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced a comprehensive program to rebuild the shattered economies of Western Europe. Over the next 4 years, the United States would transfer roughly $13.3 billion to 17 European nations, the equivalent of about $137 billion in today's money. It was presented and is still widely remembered as an act of extraordinary generosity, and in many ways, it was. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild devastated economies, fed hungry populations, and prevented the kind of political instability that might have allowed communist parties to come to power through democratic elections. But the Marshall Plan was also something else entirely. It was a tool of economic integration designed to bind Western Europe to the American economic system and create a vast market for American goods. The participating nations had to agree to conditions imposed by the United States, including the reduction of trade barriers and the adoption of market-oriented economic policies. The Marshall Plan generated a resurgence of European industrialization, but it was also a massive stimulant to the American economy, creating stable export markets for American manufacturers at a time when many feared the country might slide back into depression without wartime spending to sustain demand. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov actually attended the initial planning meetings for the Marshall Plan in Paris, but he walked out after just a few days, declaring that the plan was nothing more than a tool of American economic domination. He was not entirely wrong. The open-door conditions attached to Marshall Plan aid were fundamentally incompatible with the Soviet economic model. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other Eastern European nations that initially expressed interest in participating were forced by Moscow to decline. The Soviet leadership could only see this as a threat to all its security interests. In September of 1947, Stalin's response came swiftly. He established the Kominform, the Communist Information Bureau, and at its founding meeting in Poland, Soviet ideologue Andrei Zhdanov delivered his famous two camps speech, dividing the world into an imperialist American camp and a democratic Soviet-led camp. The battle lines were drawn, but notice the sequence of events. It was the economic architecture, Bretton Woods, the termination of Lend-Lease, the Marshall Plan, that preceded and in many ways provoked the political and military confrontation that followed. And then there was the bomb. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 remain among the most debated events in all of human history. The conventional narrative, the one most of us learned in school, is straightforward. The bombs were dropped to end the war with Japan quickly and to save the hundreds of thousands of American lives that would have been lost in a full-scale invasion. There is significant evidence supporting this interpretation. The Japanese military was indeed prepared to fight to the death. The Supreme War Council met the day after Hiroshima and was still arguing over surrender terms that went far beyond what the Allies would accept. But in 1965, historian Gar Alperovitz published a landmark work that offered a radically different interpretation. Drawing on the diaries of Secretary of War Henry Stimson and other newly available documents, Alperovitz argued that the primary purpose of the atomic bombings was not military, but diplomatic. He contended that after Germany's defeat, American policymakers based their strategy toward the Soviet Union on the judgment that the atomic bomb, once demonstrated, would provide leverage in negotiating the post-war world order. Stimson himself had argued that the Soviets were vulnerable to atomic intimidation and that a confrontation with Stalin over the future of Europe would be best conducted once the successful atomic test had occurred. Alperovitz's most controversial claim was that the bombs were dropped not to end the war in the Pacific, but to prevent Soviet involvement in the occupation of Japan and to demonstrate American power in a way that would make the Soviets, as one official put it, more manageable. When Truman learned at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 that the atomic test at Alamogordo had been successful, his entire demeanor changed. Multiple witnesses noted that the president became noticeably more confident and assertive in his negotiations with Stalin. No compromise was reached at Potsdam over the Balkans or the reparations issue. The bomb, even before it was used, had already changed the diplomatic calculus. Now, Al Perovitz's thesis has been extensively debated and criticized over the decades. Many historians argue that he overstates the case, that the military rationale for the bombings was genuine, and that he underestimates the genuine uncertainty about Japan's willingness to surrender. These criticisms have merit, but what is not seriously disputed anymore, even by mainstream historians, is that diplomatic considerations related to the Soviet Union played a significant role in the decision to use the bomb. The bombs may have been dropped primarily to end the war with Japan, but the strategic implications for the emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union were understood and embraced by American policymakers. Truman did not threaten Stalin directly with the weapon, but the fact of the American atomic monopoly was recognized as limiting Soviet options and serving as an implicit threat to Soviet security. And from the Soviet perspective, the message was unmistakable. The United States had just demonstrated its willingness to vaporize two entire cities in an instant. The weapon had been developed in secret without informing Moscow, even though the two nations were supposed to be allies. And it was used at a moment when the Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war against Japan, as had been agreed at Yalta, suggesting that one of the purposes might have been to end the war before Soviet forces could establish a foothold in the Pacific. Stalin reportedly told his scientists that Hiroshima had shaken the whole world and that the balance of power had been destroyed. He immediately accelerated the Soviet atomic weapons program. The arms race, the defining feature of the Cold War, began not with Soviet aggression, but with an American demonstration of overwhelming destructive power. This brings us to another figure whose role in the origins of the Cold War has been profoundly misunderstood, a diplomat named George Frost Kennan. In February of 1946, Kennan was stationed at the American Embassy in Moscow when he received a routine inquiry from Washington asking why the Soviets were being uncooperative about joining the World Bank and the IMF. Kennan, who had been frustrated for years by what he saw as Washington's naivety about Soviet intentions, seized the opportunity to write what would become one of the most influential documents in American diplomatic history, the so-called Long Telegram. The Long Telegram was an 8,000-word cable that laid out in meticulous detail Kennan's analysis of Soviet behavior and his recommendations for how the United States should respond. He argued that the Soviet Union did not see the possibility for long-term peaceful coexistence with the capitalist world, that its leadership was driven by a combination of Marxist ideology and traditional Russian insecurity, and that while Soviet power was impervious to the logic of reason, it was highly sensitive to the logic of force. The telegram circulated rapidly through the highest levels of the Truman administration and transformed Kennan from a relatively obscure diplomat into one of the most influential strategists of his era. A year later, Kennan published an anonymous article in Foreign Affairs magazine under the pseudonym X, in which he argued that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient but firm, and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Containment became the defining strategy of American Cold War policy for the next 4 decades. But here's the critical irony that most histories of the Cold War gloss over. Kennan himself was horrified by what his ideas became. He had explicitly defined containment as a political and economic strategy, not a military one. He argued that the United States should carefully choose its points of resistance based on a dispassionate assessment of national interests, not try to oppose Soviet influence everywhere on Earth simultaneously. He prioritized Western Europe, Germany, and Japan as the areas of vital importance and argued that outside these select zones, the United States should not overcommit itself. He judged Soviet leaders to be cautious opportunists, motivated less by Marxist ideology than by Russian security interests, which meant they could be managed through skillful diplomacy rather than massive military buildup. But the doctrine of containment was almost immediately hijacked by forces far more hawkish than Kennan himself. In 1950, Paul Nitze, who had replaced Kennan as head of the State Department's policy planning staff, produced a document called NSC-68, which fundamentally transformed what containment meant in practice. NSC-68 declared that the Cold War was a global conflict in which the defeat of free institutions anywhere was a defeat everywhere. It called for massive increases in defense spending, the development of the hydrogen bomb, and increased military aid to American allies around the world. Under the Truman administration alone, defense spending tripled as a percentage of gross domestic product. Kennan was disgusted. He later said he was appalled by the assumptions SC-68 made about Soviet intentions, and he opposed both the hydrogen bomb and the rearmament of Germany. But by then, the machinery was in motion. The Korean War broke out just months after NSC-68 was drafted, providing the perfect justification for the massive military buildup the document had recommended. The Cold War was being militarized at a pace and scale that its original architect never intended and actively opposed. And this is perhaps the most important thing that historians have gotten wrong about the Cold War's origins. It wasn't a single event or a single decision that started it. It was a process driven not primarily by ideology, but by a constellation of economic interests, institutional incentives, and political dynamics that made confrontation more profitable than cooperation. Think about who benefited from the Cold War. The defense industry, which saw its budgets explode from roughly $13 billion in 1947 to over $50 billion by 1953. The intelligence agencies, which grew from wartime ad hoc operations into vast permanent bureaucracies with global reach. The political leaders who discovered that anti-communism was the most powerful electoral tool in American politics, capable of silencing critics, justifying any expenditure, and branding anyone who questioned the consensus as disloyal. President Eisenhower himself warned about this dynamic in his famous farewell address of 1961, when he cautioned the American people about the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. He was describing a system that had already been in operation for over a decade, a system that had transformed the Cold War from a manageable geopolitical rivalry into an existential struggle that consumed trillions of dollars and shaped every aspect of American life for half a century. The Soviet side of the equation was equally complex. Stalin's paranoia was real, but it was also rational, or at least comprehensible, given Russia's historical experience. The country had been invaded from the West 3 times in less than 150 years, by Napoleon in 1812, by Germany in 1914, and by Hitler in 1941. The last invasion killed an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, a number so staggering that it's almost impossible to comprehend. The devastation was total. 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages were destroyed. Roughly 25 million people were left homeless. The Soviet industrial base, much of which had been laboriously built during the 1930s at enormous human cost, was shattered. When American historians describe Soviet policy in Eastern Europe as aggressive expansionism, they are not wrong, but they are often leaving out the context. For Stalin, controlling the buffer states of Eastern Europe was not primarily about spreading communist ideology. It was about ensuring that no army could ever again march across the Polish plains and into the Russian heartland. The Soviet demand for friendly governments on its western border was, from Moscow's perspective, a minimum security requirement, not an opening bid for world domination. This doesn't excuse the brutality of Soviet occupation or the suppression of democratic movements across Eastern Europe, but it does complicate the simple narrative of unprovoked Soviet aggression that has dominated Western historiography for decades. The revisionist historians of the 1960s and 70s, writing against the backdrop of the Vietnam War and the broader crisis of American credibility, pushed back hard against the orthodox narrative. Gabriel and Joyce Kolko argued that American policy was both reflexively anti-communist and counter-revolutionary, that the United States was fighting not just Soviet influence, but any form of challenge to American economic and political prerogatives. Walter Lefebvre traced the roots of Cold War tensions all the way back to 19th century conflicts between Russia and the United States over the opening of East Asia to American trade. Thomas Patterson went even further, arguing that the United States would have pursued the same globalist policies whether or not the Soviet Union existed as an adversary. These arguments were provocative and sometimes overstated. The revisionists had a tendency to underestimate Soviet agency and treat Stalin's regime as essentially reactive, which was a serious analytical error. But their core contribution, the insistence that American economic imperatives be taken seriously as a driver of Cold War policy, has proven remarkably durable. The post-revisionist synthesis that now dominates the field, associated primarily with the historian John Lewis Gaddis, acknowledges that Soviet expansionism was real, but that American overreaction also contributed significantly to the confrontation. Melvin Leffler's landmark study from 1992, widely regarded as the most sophisticated account of early Cold War American policy, emphasized security rather than economic imperialism as the primary driver. But his meticulous archival work also showed just how deeply intertwined economic and security considerations were in the minds of American policymakers. And this brings us full circle back to the question of what historians have gotten wrong. The answer, I think, is not that any single school of thought has the complete picture, but that the conventional framing of the Cold War as primarily an ideological conflict has obscured the deeper economic and financial dynamics that drove the confrontation. The Cold War was not simply freedom versus communism. It was a struggle over the terms of the global economic order, over who would control the institutions of international finance, over who would have access to markets and resources, and over who would bear the costs of maintaining the system. The Bretton Woods system, which Harry Dexter White designed and John Maynard Keynes reluctantly accepted, was the foundation on which the entire Cold War edifice was built. It established the dollar as the world's reserve currency, gave the United States effective control over the IMF and the World Bank, and created a framework for global trade that was spectacularly beneficial to American interests. When the Soviet Union refused to join, it wasn't because Stalin was irrational or because communist ideology demanded isolation. It was because the system was designed in a way that would have required the Soviets to open their economy to American influence and accept American-dominated institutions as the arbiters of global finance. No self-respecting great power, least of all one that had just lost 27 million people defending itself against invasion, was going to accept those terms. The Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the policy of containment, the atomic monopoly, the abrupt termination of Lend-Lease, the militarization of containment through NSC 68, all of these were not simply defensive responses to Soviet provocations. They were components of a comprehensive strategy to establish and maintain American economic and military supremacy on a global scale. That the Soviet Union's own actions, its brutal occupation of Eastern Europe, its ideological rigidity, its police state methods, provided ample justification for this strategy does not change the fact that the strategy itself was driven by interests that had very little to do with promoting democracy or defending freedom. The Cold War, in the end, was a war about money. It was about markets and currencies and trade routes and control over the institutions that govern global finance. It was about oil in the Middle East, and tin in Southeast Asia, and uranium in Africa. It was about ensuring that the dollar remained the currency in which the world conducted its business, and that the doors of every nation on earth remained open to American goods, American capital, and American influence. The ideological dimension was real, but it was also in many ways a costume that economic interests wore in public. Behind the rhetoric about freedom and democracy, behind the nuclear arsenals and the spy games and the proxy wars, the fundamental question was always the same: who controls the money? And the answer from 1944 onward was overwhelmingly clear. The United States controlled the money. It controlled the institutions. It controlled the reserve currency. It controlled the military alliances that protected the economic order. And anyone who challenged that control, whether they were Soviet communists or Latin American socialists or Middle Eastern nationalists, faced the full weight of American power. That is the true origin of the Cold War. Not a clash of civilizations, not a battle between good and evil, but a struggle for economic supremacy disguised as an ideological crusade. The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. Harry Dexter White, for all his flaws and his murky connections to Soviet intelligence, understood something that his successors did not. He understood that bringing the Soviet Union into the global economic system, even on imperfect terms, was preferable to dividing the world into hostile blocs. He understood that economic cooperation, however messy and compromised, was the best insurance against another world war. His vision was imperfect and perhaps naive, but it was a vision of integration rather than confrontation. When that vision died, when the loan to the Soviets was never offered, when Lend-Lease was cut off with brutal abruptness, when the Marshall Plan was structured in a way that Moscow could never accept, the die was cast. The Cold War lasted roughly 4.5 decades. It consumed trillions of dollars. It killed millions of people in proxy wars across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. It brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation on multiple occasions. And it left a legacy of militarism, surveillance, and institutional distrust that continues to shape our world today. All of this might have been avoided, or at least significantly mitigated, if the economic foundations of the post-war order had been designed differently. If the Bretton Woods system had been more genuinely multilateral. If the Marshall Plan had been offered without conditions that the Soviets could never accept. If the atomic bomb had never been used as a tool of diplomatic intimidation. If the enormous profits that flowed to the military-industrial complex from permanent Cold War mobilization had not created powerful constituencies with a vested interest in perpetuating the conflict. But history doesn't deal in what-ifs. What it does deal in is evidence, and the evidence is clear. The Cold War's true origins lie not in the simple clash of ideologies that we were taught in school, but in a far more complex and far more troubling story about the relationship between money, power, and the willingness of great nations to reshape the world in their own image. The historians haven't exactly gotten it wrong, but for too long, they have been telling only half the story. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this. If the Cold War was fundamentally about economic control, about who gets to write the rules of the global financial system and who profits from those rules, then has it really ended? Or has it simply taken on new forms with new adversaries and new battlegrounds while the underlying logic remains exactly the same? Because when you look at the world today, at the trade wars, the sanctions regimes, the competition over reserve currencies, the struggle for control of technology and resources, you start to wonder whether the Cold War wasn't an anomaly at all. Maybe it was just the most visible chapter of a much longer story, one that began with Bretton Woods and hasn't ended yet. If this deep dive into the hidden economic gears of history changed how you view the origins of global power, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. Plant the seeds of the future. The next treasury of knowledge will open soon.